Hey everyone, I'm Doc Miles at North American Rescue. Today I'm going to be going over some ventilator tips for people that either are not familiar anymore or don't often use ventilators. The Joint Trauma System recently came out with an updated CPG or clinical practice guideline on mechanical ventilation basics. The JTS CPG talks about some basic settings that'll get you set up for initial success with your patient, and then you can adjust from there. The first thing you're gonna need is a few key pieces of equipment. So first of all, I've got a secured airway for my patient. That can either be an endotracheal tube where I've intubated the patient, or in this patient, I've done a crike to secure the airway. Next up, I want a vent. So here we've got the HeroVent, which is a really nice option if you don't use ventilators very often. It's small, it's compact, and it's got a lot of features that'll help you get off to an easy start and then be able to refine with your patient. We've got our connector tubing, which I already have set up. I've got an end-tidal CO2 monitor. This is an EMA. The end-tidal CO2 detector is critical for patient monitoring when they're on a vent. This is really what we can use to get a good idea of how well our patient is doing and how we need to adjust some of the settings to optimize their success. Finally, I also have a pulse oximeter on me. So you can see this equipment, fairly compact. I can monitor what their oxygen status is. I can get their pulse. I can get their end-tidal CO2. And then also, anytime I ventilate a patient, a ventilator is great, but if it runs out of batteries, if there's some sort of a failure or some sort of a problem, I want to have a backup. So I'm always going to have my BVM with me. And that way, if everything goes wrong, I can always grab the BVM and I can mechanically ventilate on my own with or without a ventilator. Finally, I'm always going to have the ability to decompress a patient's chest if needed. I've got an Enhanced ARS with me. Keep in mind, like we've posted about before, tension pneumothorax can develop much more rapidly and severe in a patient that you are ventilating. So if I'm doing positive pressure ventilation, which basically means I'm forcing air into that patient's chest, either with a bag or with a ventilator, it's pressurizing the chest more. I'm getting more pressure in than if they were spontaneously breathing. And because of that increased pressure, if there's damage to the lung or they blow out a bleb or one of the alveoli or some of the alveoli in the patient, that can force air from the outside through that defect in the lung and into the chest wall, causing a tension pneumothorax. So anytime you're ventilating a patient, you need to be very careful to look out for a tension pneumothorax. So let's talk about initial ventilator setup. So what we want to do is get a good idea of our patient size, and that can be a rough guess. And then we're going to go through the steps in the JTS CPG to determine initial ventilator settings. Keep in mind that this is kind of a general ballpark guess at a patient. There's going to be a lot of different circumstances where we're going to have very different ventilator settings, and you can go through literally hundreds of different settings and adjustments for your patient. So this is a way to get a ballpark look and then adjust fire from there once you're set up in ventilating the patient. So I've got my ventilator, it's turned on. The first thing I'm gonna do is set the mode. Right over here, I'm gonna pick AC. AC is assist control. And essentially what that does is it's a setting in the ventilator where I pick the respiratory rate. So here we're gonna have it picked at 14. At least 14 times a minute, that ventilator is going to deliver an entire tidal volume of air that I set. So one complete breath. Now what AC does is it also allows the patient to breathe on their own. So if the patient starts to inhale, even if it's a weak inhalation, the ventilator will sense that and it'll deliver an entire breath of air to that patient. So if I have it set at 14, at a baseline, the patient is going to breathe 14 if they don't do any work at all. If they overbreathe that, then they can have a higher respiratory rate. So they could be breathing at a rate of 20, and this thing is just making sure they get a full tidal volume each time they inhale. If the patient stops breathing, it's going to go back to the default rate of 14 breaths per minute. Now, in setting up a tidal volume, there's a couple different ways you can do it. The ideal start for a tidal volume for your patient is 4 to 6 mLs per kilogram of ideal body weight. So if your patient is overweight, we're going to go off their ideal body weight, which is really based on their height. That's the calculation for it. Now, there's a nice table in the JTS CPG, which goes through different heights that you can just kind of keep in hand and have that memorized. What I like to do is I memorize it for myself for a starting point. So I'm 5'9", 69 inches. Ideal starting tidal volume is going to be 420 mLs. And then I can adjust from there as a good guesstimate based on if my patient is taller than me or if they're shorter than me. So I'm going to go ahead and program in 420, and I'm going to confirm that. I've now got my mode. I've got my tidal volume. The next thing I'm going to do is pick my respiratory rate. JTS CPG recommends that we initially start with a respiratory rate of 14. Now, the next setting that pops up is PEEP. PEEP is positive end expiratory pressure. And what that does is at the end of the breath, as it ventilates the patient, then the patient will start exhaling. It'll allow that patient to exhale, but it will also keep some pressure as that patient exhales. What that extra little bit of pressure, or PEEP, does is it helps keep the alveoli open, and so you get better gas exchange. So if a patient is already hypoxic and you're starting them on a ventilator, you may want to start with a PEEP of 10, but in general, a 5 works pretty well. And then if you go up from there, that may help their oxygenation status that we're getting from their pulse ox. So I've got my PEEP set at 5. The final setting that we're going to adjust prior to ventilating our patient, or as we're ventilating our patient, is the FiO2, and that's the fraction of inspired oxygen. In general, what we want to do is we want to start out with 100%, and that's maximizing the oxygen content in the air that's being pushed into that patient. That's a great starting point, and then we can adjust back from there. The goal in your FiO2 is to go ahead and keep your pulse ox above 92%. So again, I'm going to take a look at my pulse ox. If I'm above 92%, great. I can start taking down that oxygen level. The nice thing about doing that is that conserves oxygen, because oxygen tanks are big, heavy, and they'll run out if you just keep them blasting. So it's a great way to conserve. The JTS CPG also has a way to calculate your burn rate on oxygen, so you know how long that oxygen cylinder is going to last, or at least you get a rough estimate. So now I've got my initial settings set. I'm ventilating the patient. The next thing I'm going to do now is look at my end-tidal CO2, and now I can adjust it for that patient. In general, I want to keep an end-tidal CO2 of 35 to 45. Now, there's a lot more information you can dig into and learn on end-tidal CO2, what the waveform looks like, and how to expect those waveforms to look in different types of physiology. For right now, we're just going to say, hey, you need to have an end-tidal CO2, and then we're going to adjust respiratory rate and volume based on how our end-tidal CO2 is doing.